access and get different people talking to each other. So, so that's really the geometric law is that more than doubling the density will more than double the demand. You can then, every community gets to make a decision about what they want to do with that. What I've done with several transit agencies is taken them through a process of saying, okay, what percentage of your budget do you want to spend pursuing ridership? Okay, great. 70%, 80%, 60%, whatever it is, great. Then this other slice you can devote to pursuing coverage, say, or universal access, or a goal like that. And if you actually come to that policy decision, as several transit agencies have that I've worked with, then a transit planner like me can actually go design a network and document it back to you and say, these are the ridership services, those are the coverage services. What else is great is then when a Wendell Cox or a Randall O'Toole or some other sort of ideological opponent of public transit starts producing calculations to say, look how ineffective transit is, look how empty so many of these buses are. We have a correct answer, which is yes, that 40% of our buses are supposed to be empty. That's how we designed them. We're providing a social service there. We're not trying to fill those buses. Judge our ridership performance based on the percentage of our service that's actually trying to attend ridership, right? That sort of thing. So I guess what I want to say in summing up and get us into a conversation, I think we can do well if we listen to geometry first. It's what manuals do at their best, to give everyone a common framework in the unavoidable geometry that will affect any project at all. I do have, I should mention, a contract that I'm about to sign with Island Press to do a fairly friendly populist book that will be built on some of these ideas, and maybe it will be something that kind of advances that conversation. So transit agencies need to consider also forms of presentation that emphasize the usefulness of the service rather than the technology used to provide it. I'm always advocating, as you know, for frequent network mapping, which is basically don't draw it like that, because that's not true. Use the width of the line or something else to suggest the fact that this is going to be half as frequent as that, and when you're actually trying to get somewhere, that's going to matter. It's interesting to me, I should mention this about frequency. When you look at what are the factors of the transit service that actually affects people's ridership, you get this overwhelming emphasis on waiting time. People hate to wait. The wait is the problem. Well, frequency is the variable that drives waiting time, obviously, and yet it's very common also to see decisions made where frequency is considered a detail. We'll get to that later. We've got this nice structure, we'll worry later about the frequency. Wrong. No, waiting time is the dominant feature. So frequency really ought to be one of the most important variables. And when I worked with Seattle DOT on their own transit policy, we put a lot of emphasis on frequency and on focusing our attention on what we would call a frequent network, or what Seattle calls the urban village transit network. One of the things I think is interesting about frequency is that I think that leaders who are themselves personal individual motorists are likely to not get why frequency matters. Even when I explain it to them, they understand intellectually what it is. It's the exact time. They understand intellectually what it is. They just don't get it the way they get speed, or the way they get vehicle choice. Because speed and vehicle choice are, of course, things that a motorist experiences, right? There isn't a motorist equivalent of frequency. Apart from the closest thing we have is the cycling traffic signal, right? It gives you an experience, something like frequency. So always be aware, always be thinking, is that a motorist's perspective? Is somebody projecting a motorist's expectations onto how transit works? Because I think that happens a lot. Only if you were a habitual motorist would this map look okay to you as a transit plan, right? If you understood how transit works, you see immediately that there may be problems. So above all, though, I suggest that as you're sorting claims, you think about where on the spectrum the claim lies. Because if it's high up on the spectrum and emotionally driven, you're going to need to make sure that it's consistent with the cold facts. Because again, the cold facts do win in the end, no matter how much passion you may have behind an idea. If it's impractical, if it can't be made to work in the context of physics and geometry, it's not going to work, like the airport fire station. So thank you very much. That's all I want to say. Throw out some questions, have conversations. We're going until 6:30.
I have a question. I'd like interested to hear what your opinion
You're talking, that's a rather big general question.
The underground.
The underground.
Trains and that.
Well, London is not a city I'm very close to, so I have, as a result, one of the important laws of transit tourism, right, is that transit systems look better if you're a little further away from them. One of the most exasperating things about Sydney for me, for example, is that Sydney has this tourist's fare card that is designed to be very convenient for tourists but useless for local commuters. And it gets you on all the different transit systems. And so tourists go away from Sydney and say, Sydney has this wonderful fare system. Drives us nuts. It's not something we can use, it's just something for tourists. I think that the ultimate judgment on public transport in London lies in the congestion charge. That the congestion charge only happened because there was a certain degree of commitment to transit. And also because so much transit was there before. And although it was Ken Livingstone's project, and Boris Johnson tried to undo it. He hasn't been able to undo it. The core of the congestion charge is still there because it's just very popular. London is also fortunate in a British context, and this is an amazing thing about Britain. London is the only city in Britain where government, public employees actually get to design the transit system. Everywhere else, private operating companies are not just operating, but they're actually designing. And when you encounter a border between two operating companies, you have the same kinds of problems that you encounter here when you encounter a county. But I don't know if you have a more specific question about London. But
I was just curious.
Yeah. Chris.
Speaking of fare, question one is, which transit organization in your experience has the most complex fare structure, least user-friendly, and do you have reason to believe that that has an effect on ridership?
It does. The complexity does have an effect. I travel enough, I mean, I've been traveling now for a couple of months, and every city I've encountered a new fare system. And I've come out of the airport and had to figure out a new fare machine. And there's no question that fare complexity is a deterrent to ridership. I am aware of it deterring me. I am aware of having instances where I'd like to use the bus, but it's just too frigging complicated, so I yell at Kate. Having said that, North America is actually relatively good at this. We have in Sydney, and the answer to your specific question, which is the worst, I would have to say Sydney. Sydney is running on an ancient fare structure in which, first of all, there's no concept of a transfer at all, because if you remember the maps I showed you, Sydney is trying to run a bus from every bus stop to the same stop in the city. And so, of course, none of those routes are very frequent, but also, they don't have a logical fare that gets you through a connection. They also keep track of absurdly small units of distance. They keep track of distances of about 1.6 Ks, they call them fare section, 1.6 kilometers. I think I may have been the first to point out, no, 1.6 kilometers, that's an interesting decimal. That's a mile. That is a ridiculous effect. So this thing is so old, it predates the adoption of the metric system. This is pretty archaic, but Sydney being what it is, I have done my bit in writing a number of reports explaining why this is crazy, and it goes on a shelf alongside several decades worth of reports explaining why this is crazy. And it still goes on. Sir.
So you talked about the two parallel lines, and you can combine them to have more frequency. Right. But one of the things you didn't really highlight was the fact that what I've observed as a transplanter is that it's more efficient as well. It's not just a 2-for-1 relationship, like two 30-minute routes combined into a 15 route. You can usually afford a 12-minute frequency or a more frequent service because you can design it more efficiently.
That's right.
Now, this is interesting here working at Metro in that we just had a big audit on efficiency, which was absolutely silent on route designs. It was all about scheduling efficiency, and which has led to some other problems that we're currently having in that they just did some of this cycle time analysis efficiency on 3 routes. And the routes are designed to operate together, but they treated them separately. And so it has completely